Well, hello, friends, and welcome back to another episode of Barriers and Boundaries Resilience Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, EB, and we're talking about healthy employees creating healthy organizations, and what an opportunity to really look at organizational resilience today. And one key aspect with strategic communications. I had a chance to reconnect with a colleague that I hadn't seen in a number of years, but I know is just an expertise in strategic communications, and thought it'd be a good idea just to talk about what that is and how it connects to organizational resilience and see where the conversation goes from there. So I want to welcome Ben Tisdale to the show today. How you doing, Ben?
Hey, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on today. It's good to see you again. I think it's been, about 10 years or so since we last talked?
Yeah, I think it's been about 10. Yeah, that's right. So still looking the same, still looking your youthful self. So
Well, I was going to say
make
the same to you, man.
yeah.
You're good.
So, can you inform some of our listeners and viewers here more about who you are before we kind of get things going here?
Sure. And thanks again, seriously, for having me on the show. And I've watched your podcast. I appreciate this opportunity to talk a little bit about the intersection of strategic communication and organizational resilience. Because I don't think these two topics are talked about together, but I do think that there's a lot of overlap. And I think strategic communication can really support strong organizational resilience. But before we get into that, so I am about to retire from the Navy after serving 20 years as a public affairs professional. So that being said, of course, I have to disclose right off the top that our discussion are my opinions and my opinions alone. They don't represent the Department of Defense, Department of the Navy, just me, myself, and I.
Congrats, by the way, on your
Oh,
service. Yeah.
yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. It's been a great run. So as you can imagine, after 20 years, I've had the opportunity to serve all over the world. Thanks to the Navy, I've been to great places like Spain. I've also served a couple of deployments in Afghanistan. I've worked with great teams, great professionals, great bosses. And I think that one of the things I've become really passionate about in communication in particular is the idea of making sure that our actions matches our words and our values as well, and vice versa. Because I've learned, and you maybe have seen this as well, is that if we're communicating something that is not consistent with an organization's values, really good character and ethics, it creates, I believe, organizational stress. And, this is where it gets into retention issues and talent management, where people start to get frustrated and look elsewhere. I really don't know if people take that seriously enough. So I'm really excited to talk more about how strategic communication can support organizations.
That's a great layout for our conversation today, too. And let's just start with the basic definition of how you define strategic communications, or is there kind of an industry standard of strategic communication?
I think you could probably ask any public relations professional, and you're probably going to get a slightly different answer. The first time I was exposed to the term was back in 2007 when I went through Defense Information School. And the DoD has a really long definition. I won't bore your audience with it. I'll use more of the academic term, and it's pretty simple. It is the purposeful use of communication to achieve an organization's mission and objectives. Super simple. It's outcome oriented. It's meant to be audience centric, and it's meant to provide value to the organization itself. So pretty simple. I'll add on one other aspect of that. So I don't know if you remember Admiral Mullen, former Joint Chiefs of Staff. He wrote an article, I'll never forget it, in Joint Forces Quarterly back in 2009 about how strategic communication, while messaging is important, we also want to make sure that the actions also match what the organization wants to do and its values or whatnot. He was concerned at the time that sometimes we get too wrapped around the axle on making sure our wording for messaging is perfect, but not spending enough time to take a holistic look at the organization, the command, its actions itself, and making sure that they're aligned.
There's a good connection with that relatedness piece. It's what it sounds like, where you're thinking big picture. How does this message relate to other aspects of what we got going on, or even kind of some of the dialogue happening amongst the staff and just how it's perceived by the staff?
that's part of it as well. We talked about this before the show, but you have many stakeholders in any organization, and one of the most important at its core is your employees. So that would be more of your internal communication side. We often think of the external side, media, Congress, and that's all good, important, but really your employees, I would argue, are more important because they are also putting the message out there, whether they know it or not. If you're working for a great company, you're probably, when you engage your neighbors, you're going to share kind of your enthusiasm for working for that organization, right? But if you're not having a great experience, you have issues, you might be very candid with your neighbors, and that messaging just kind of goes out there, and it's not really what you want, but that's just the reality of the situation.
I've seen a lot of places where good retention is probably your best recruiting, where you're taking care of your employees and that kind of affirmation of, yeah, this company lives out their values, and you can see that in what's displayed across, media or just how they feel about their environment. That's a great aspect to it.
Yeah, definitely. The other thing too that I think is important especially for organizational leaders to consider is that in strategic communication, and this is true to some extent in marketing and investor relations, really all communication fields, that it's not just the talking that matters, it's also the listening that matters, especially to your employees. So that is it gives that situational awareness to your leadership. Hey, what are people talking about? So it could be focus groups, it could be surveys, it could be click rates on an intranet site, on policies or news stories or whatnot. I think all strategic communication professionals have an obligation to take information from their teammates, to use military parlance, and provide kind of a summary, a snapshot, if you will, to the leaders, so the leaders can make the best decisions possible, have a sense of what's going on at the deck plate level. You like that Navy term, didn't you?
I do. I do. So you talked about feedback. Is there any best practice you like, or just kind of depends on the situation?
Honestly, it's hard in the sense that if you don't have the people to run really good, and not necessarily, you don't need teams, but you really do need at least one or two dedicated professionals to help actually do the analysis, run surveys and focus groups. It's hard, as you know, in some organizations, when you're the public relations professional, you're one of one. So you can't necessarily roll out the red carpet, if you will, of the best possible collection methods. But surveys are ideal, and money too is the biggest thing. There are lots of digital tools available now that make it easier, but it still ultimately costs money. So absent of that, if you don't have those types of exquisite tools, nothing beats just going out and talking to people and getting a feel to what's actually going on in the organization itself.
Is resources, finances, budgets for building out this program, is that a common thing that you see? There's somebody that's listening that's in strategic communication, sitting at home saying, yes, like I don't have the money. I'd never have the budget to do what I want to do.
Yeah,
Is that a
there is actually you've hit on a little bit of an issue. There is a I remember when I went through grad school about 12 years ago. There was this mindset that if you have the knowledge for how to do things like surveys or actually do really good quantitative research, you'll make it happen. It's not about how many people you have or how much money or whatnot. I at the time I drank that Kool-Aid, but as I've gotten a little bit older and worked in a variety of organizations, I've realized there's actually some truth to that kind of, not complaint, but reality. As you know, investment speaks very loudly. And so if an organization values its internal communication, they're going to allocate resourcing to make it happen. If everything is in any organization, you have to prioritize what's important. And so if the money is there and the resourcing is there, you will be able to get a lot out of it. But if it's not really there, then again, you can come up with kind of your homemade tools per se, but it's not going to be easy.
That sounds like a great encouragement to a young PR, young strategic communicator that's, just getting started, is really trying to find ways to let the organization know the value added that strategic communications can have. Because I think it just comes down to, if they see the value added in it, they're going to invest more into it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I wanted to ask you about the differences, internal, external communications. How does that work in your field from your perspective, having done this for so long?
No, great question. So, for most of my time in the Navy, we think of our internal audiences as our sailors and our families. And depending on what level of command you're at, the scope obviously gets bigger. So, if you're at a major command, and I'll say like US Pacific Fleet or US Fleet Forces Command, you could think of these as business segments of a large defense contractor. Now you're starting to include senior leaders throughout your military organizations, your command master chiefs, your executive officers, etc. So that's kind of the internal side. On the external side, now we're thinking the broad American public. We're thinking about Congress. Depending on who you ask, media either is or is not an audience. We won't get into that debate. And then it also depends on the mission of the organization itself. Some commands I've been at are very externally focused. As an example, in the Navy, we have the Office of Community Outreach, and they help facilitate many of all the Navy weeks across the United States. They are very, very externally focused. That's their mission, that's their role. Whereas other commands that I was at, like U.S. Navy Reserve, as their public affairs officer, I was more focused on informing our selected reservists and making sure that they knew all the policies for pay, mobilization, or whatnot. When it comes to strategic communication, however, you'll always want to, if when it makes sense, to tailor your messages to the different audiences, but the core kind of truthful aspects of what you're putting out to the different audiences should not change at all.
Okay. Yeah.
That's that consistency that ensures trust and credibility. Because without that, then no one's going to have faith
Yeah.
in what
Trust.
you're putting out.
Yeah. Trust is a pretty massive aspect to organizational culture. And it goes back to what you were saying at the beginning, how it could build resilience that ties into retention and even recruiting. Is a lot of the external communications, has that been more proactive or reactive for you? Do you feel like your posture is trying to be proactive in a sense of getting ahead of the narrative?
Man, that's a great question. So I on the surface, I've had a career in which I've worked mostly with organizations that tend not to seek out media. Two examples. I was the public affairs officer for U.S. Fleet Cyber, so that's like the Navy cyber component, and then also Naval Special Warfare, which I know you've had extensive experience with as well. Neither one of those organizations, I think, really seeks the limelight. It's not really part of their mission, and it's not really part of the culture. And that being said, there have been times where you do want to be proactive when you work with those organizations. But again, it goes back to that definition of strategic communication. It has to be purposeful and it has to support the organization's mission. So I'll give a quick example. At Naval Special Warfare, the recruiting crisis, was affecting everybody, not just the Navy, but all the services. So we purposefully took a big step to do more on social media to support the recruiting element for our SEALs and SWICs. That was a conscious decision. Rather than just being on social media just for its own sake, our team deliberately made a greater effort to start tailoring product to reach younger audiences via the platforms like Instagram or whatnot that we knew they were on. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yeah, no, that definitely ties right into it. And I like the aspect of it depends.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
It kind of depends on, what the situation is. We have intellect, we have IQ, we have EQ with emotional intelligence. There's also this, what I see a lot in your field is you just got to think contextually, like contextual awareness. knowing what this message is going to impact, or how you want that to be placed in a certain time of the day, certain day of the week. There's certain aspects to it that ability to think strategically. I equate that to contextually as well.
Yeah, Eric, that's a really good point because I think I'll give an example of that. So, downrange in Afghanistan, this is roughly about maybe 8, 7 years ago. When I first got there, my job was to advise Afghans in how to do public relations. But I also worked alongside other PR professionals who were, trying to get information out to the Afghans about the status of the war and other aspects. And a lot of the focus was on social media. You probably know this, but the vast majority of Afghans in the country are not able to read. They're illiterate. And while many of the more Kabul urban citizens of Afghanistan certainly had mobile devices or whatnot, not everybody was actually using them. And so, in terms of context, what do Afghans rely on? Radio, like an old school type thing that for the military, it wasn't sexy, it wasn't sleek, but that was just the reality of what was effective and what they actually trusted. So context, particularly when you're working in an international context, is so important. We use Western civilization methods and think that's what everybody uses. And that's not necessarily the case. Every culture is technologically different, culturally, in terms of values, different. And you have to adjust not just your messaging, but also the platforms by which you're communicating as well.
Sure. And even with a lot of new developments in technology, software, there's a whole field of user experience design, right? The human centric interface, the user interface. And I've taken some courses on this just online, on a whim. One of the things that came out of that was empathy is the first step. And showing empathy, like that's exactly what you're describing, is a form of empathy of, let me understand your perspective before we start offering you a service or a product. And that's a great story to kind of capture that contextualization. And that just keeps pushing the train forward, moving the needle, or however you want to describe it. But it's progression. And
Yeah, I one of the things I learned early on in my career, very early. I was a junior officer. I was working at Fleet Forces Command. At the time, the Navy was exploring building a new outlying landing field in the Virginia, North Carolina area. As part of the Environmental Protection Act, whenever the federal government looks to seek to build something of that magnitude, it has to do an environmental assessment and it has to go through a study. And long story short, we would have town halls with the local community and we would go there, we give our presentation, and not everybody was excited about having a military airfield in their backyard. But I will say what I learned was that while a lot of people were not supportive and they were certainly angry, a lot of people expressed appreciation for the fact that we were even taking the time to meet them where they were and actually listen to their concerns. And I've never forgotten that oftentimes people just want to be heard. People want to be validated. And if you don't give them that opportunity, you're only creating, I think, an adversary, so to speak, in the information space. I'm not saying that you're going to do whatever they want you to do. Sometimes that's not possible, but you at least as a leader, as a PR professional, you have an obligation to listen to your stakeholders, no matter if you agree with them or not.
recently, I had a guest on, Dr. Emma Serro from the Neuro Leadership Institute, and a lot of cognitive science behind information sharing, and just the basic principle: information is rewarding or it's threatening.
Yeah.
And the ability to share rewarding information, like the ability to kind of pick up on that context and share the information that way, that's value added. That's value added. Just kind of backing up a little bit, what are some, I don't know, some pitfalls, some danger areas that you've seen the communicators kind of get in trouble with? What are some warning signs that you would offer to someone getting into this?
Gosh, there's so many. I'll try to think of the biggest ones that I've learned the hard way.
Yeah.
So hopefully no one out there has to, or repeats some of the things that I've done or I've seen. One of the things is the easiest, and it's a temptation that I've seen not just with communicators but everyone in an organization, and that's sometimes the temptation to hide things or not necessarily be completely truthful, a fear of creating a panic or not wanting to be embarrassed. I don't know what it is about the universe, but the truth always seems to find a way to come out one way or another. It could be today, could be 10 years from now, but one day it's going to get out. And so oftentimes you'll hear the phrase go ugly early when the Navy will get relieved of duty sometimes, and it's unfortunate, but rather than go have some sort of long drawn out investigation only to find out such and such was relieved for something, you just make the announcement. It's painful, but then relatively speaking, it's over. And it's not a drug out process. That's
Yeah.
kind of the first thing, go ugly early.
Okay.
Um, the second thing, and this is more for leaders more than anything else, is
Hmm.
that I've had my last boss, Admiral Keith Davids. One of the things I really enjoyed working with him was that we would have at least once a quarter, we would sit down. I would go over with him the numbers in terms of what we were seeing with media, social media, etc. We had a list of objectives that we were tracking for the year, and he would give feedback and we would talk through it, and he would share with me his priorities, his concerns, and we talk about it. And we would have those regular touch points that were data driven for the most part. And so, what I would say to leaders is that sometimes leaders see a public relations professional and all they see is someone who's just going to put out a news release. An analogy would be like, hey, chaplain, just give the sermon on Sundays and then that's all you do. Like
Mm.
that is such a unfortunate thing that happens sometimes. Leaders need to understand, if your public relations professional has been trained or been to school, give them that opportunity, challenge them too. How are you supporting my organization? How are you supporting my communication goals? And demand, so to speak, in a kind way, how are you helping me get to X? How are you helping me get to that mission? Some leaders don't really leverage a communicator in the way that he or she probably could be. Does that make
Mm.
sense?
Yes, that communicator is an extension of the identity of the organization, right? And it's not, if I'm hearing you correctly, it's not you being highlighted as the communicator, it's the organization that you're really trying
Right.
to capture. And have you seen communicators making a name for themselves as someone in the PA or PR field?
I will give my honest opinion on this. I have rarely seen that anymore. When I was new to the community, I'd say that there were a handful, but as time has gone on, for whatever reason, this is a great question because I never thought of it before. I really can't think of anyone now that really makes it all about themselves. It's generally about two things. One, it's about supporting the organization, and then two, it's also about highlighting people's stories. Those things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but I do know that for some people, they may not be super strong on the supporting the organization, but they're very strong on highlighting the actual individuals and organization, which ironically I think supports the first part anyway a little bit. So it's not a big deal, but that's more of what I see now than anything else.
Nice. And that, do you think that's contributed to the training that's provided for someone coming in now and really make the connection with the organization? And that's what you're there for?
But I think, especially in the last 15 years, there has been it DoD wide, I think there's been a real effort to professionalize the public affairs community. We have accreditation options now, for example, that we didn't necessarily have 20 years ago. I mean, they were there, but no one really took it seriously. Now we do. And I
Very
think
nice.
that probably has helped a lot with the mindset of our communicators, because you hit on something that it can be a bit embarrassing. Sometimes I can't think of a good Navy example or any example in the DoD, but I sometimes seen spokespersons that it's about them. And that's not really our role. We're supposed to put the people we support, out in front. That's really
Mm.
what we're called to
Yeah.
do.
Nice. Those are some really good opportunities for growth if someone's listening and they're just getting into the field, things to be mindful of. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. We can kind of transition toward wrapping our conversation up for today, but I wanted to ask you, what do you enjoy about it? What's fun for you in this field?
So let me get some context to this question. Sorry.
Great.
So
Yeah.
I joined the Navy originally to be a pilot. And so I was a student naval aviator. And then about 2 years in, I was diagnosed with a rare heart disease. And I was no longer medically fit to fly. So I had to redesignate. I didn't even know what PAO was. I was just happy to still be allowed to serve. I will be honest and say my first couple of years, I really wasn't thrilled with how life was unfolding. However, over 20 years, I started to kind of find the love in the job. And this comes down to a couple of things. Number one, nothing beats the satisfaction of seeing a colleague or someone you really respect or you know is a good sailor or a great civilian and seeing them in a story or seeing their picture up online. Nothing beats that high. Being able to get something where a product is released in a newspaper and you get pride from that. If I may, what's ironic about this is that the very first story I ever helped facilitate on behalf of the Navy was a story about religious program specialists and their support to the chaplains. It was in the Virginia Pilot. It was a 3-page spread about all the different ways that RPs support their chaplains. It was the very first story I ever helped facilitate. And it's still one of my favorites to this day because we had these unsung heroes. We told their story. Nothing beats that. The second thing I really enjoy comes from that aviation world. And that's people say in our business, oh, it's more art than science and blah, blah, blah. I was like, no, I don't agree with that. I think we can take methodical processes or come up with them like checklists and everything else. So I try to bring a little order to the chaos. So I get a little bit of fulfillment from that. The third and final piece that I think is so exciting is, years ago when I got to Naval Station Rota, Spain, we had a base paper and that's all we had. And this was back in '09. And I said, hey, there's this thing called Facebook and their organizations like Coca-Cola, like they have their own pages. We should have our own page. And people thought I was crazy. I had some people tell me not to do it. But fortunately, I had a really good boss, and he's like, hey, you work for me. If you think it's a good idea, do it. And we did. And it was amazing. I'm trying to be humble, but I feel like we really helped shape how Navy Public Affairs was using social media at the time. I get a good thrill from that, of being innovative and looking to see how we can better connect with our audiences. I've tried never to lose that. It's hard as you get older, because you're not the cool kid anymore. So I have to rely a lot more on my teenagers. But other than that, those are the three things that I think that I've really enjoyed.
Oh, I love it. And one of my favorite books is a book called How to Be Here by a guy named Rob Bell. And one of the things he talks about in that book is there's a difference between being successful versus contributing to your craft, and looking at, are you showing up every day to work to get something out of your work, or are you showing up every day to give something to your work? And I like when that switch happens for whatever field people are in, to say, yeah, you know what? Let's go with this. Let's try this out. Let's get creative and innovative. And hey, a big company like Coca-Cola is doing it. So let's, why not?
Yeah.
And I think that makes such a difference with how well people enjoy what they do, is when they feel like they're contributing to it. Ties back into that messaging, if it's aligned, just like you said. I love it how you phrased it, just the messaging aligned with the values of the organization, because that's going to get people more motivated and riled up to want to contribute more. It's like, oh yeah, we're showing off. We're not just showing up, we're showing off. And being able to do that well just ties into a big role that the strategic communications department has. Man, what a timely message, and just a great message. And so, what's next for you?
Right now, I'm currently on terminal leave. I have a few more months left. But then, honestly, one thing I would like to do at some point, I would like to hopefully start flying again. Not because I want to fly commercial or anything, but I would like to be able to get in the cockpit again and maybe go up and eventually take my wife and kids up in the air. That would be neat to kind of close that out.
Oh, that's awesome. That's great. And man, I wish you well, and I hope it's just a smooth transition for you as you move on to the other side of the Navy. And we'll keep up in touch, keep in touch with you. If someone had questions for you about this, or if they wanted to gain some more insight from you, what's a good way to stay connected with you?
I've tried to be very active on LinkedIn, so I'm pretty easy to find on LinkedIn, Ben Tisdale. But yeah, just message me. Always happy to help out wherever I can.
All right. Well, my friend, it's good to see you. Good to catch up with you. And man, thanks for sharing your expertise in this. I really appreciate it.
Anytime, man. Thanks.
All right, my friends, that was Ben Tisdale. We were talking organizational resilience through strategic communications. And what a great concept to connect your communications with the values of your organization. Personally, I hadn't thought of it that way. And that's why I wanted to have the subject matter expert come on and talk about those things. Like there were so many great things, so many lessons that he brought out and highlighted that from his wealth of experience over 20 years of doing that. And congratulations to him. If you have any comments, any insights, any things that stood out for you, please share them in the comments below. Connect with him on LinkedIn, Ben Tisdale, and I'll have his link to LinkedIn on the show notes. But thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening or watching. And we're going to keep fighting the good fight. We're going to keep pushing and striving for the most resilient person, the most resilient organization, because healthy employees create healthy organizations. And until next time, EB out here.